Hola, 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 hola. Si vos querés me podés mirar y me... Sí, llega. Ahí va, ¿está?
Okay, I think you're all here. Good morning, everyone. I'm the director of Olades Integration on behalf of the Latin American Energy Organization, the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining of Uruguay, and the IDB, and the first investment forum by IRENA. We would like to welcome you all to this 8th Energy Week. Today, our last week after a very busy week that has been certainly very productive. We would like to especially thank Uruguay and the city of Montevideo for their hospitality, and also to our main sponsors, our institutional sponsors, media partners, for their cooperation to carry out this event. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel. Basically, we have called this Distributed Generation and Consumption in Latin America. Which path are we following? As you all know, development of renewable energies and distributed energy resources in the region continues making progress in the region, representing several challenges from the financial, technical, and economic standpoint. In the last years, we have seen a significant trend in the distributed generation area that has been an increase. The reason for this development is an increased efficiency and cost of PV, and also the passing of new regulatory frameworks and incentives that make possible integration in these areas. Distributed generation is now a reality in several of the countries in the region. Of course, there are different realities and challenges to be faced in the different countries, resulting from different local strategies. This panel wants to share best practices, talk about the challenges, exchanging experiences, and I would like to welcome our great speakers that we have today. Jar Crispin from AVGT in Brazil, Marvin Fernandez from Dominican Republic, Miguel Hernandez from Acusol, Colombia, Marcelo Mula from Auder, and Dario Morales from Acesol, Chile. Please join me in a round of applause. So now I would like to listen from our experts their opinion of the current context and what they can tell us about distributed energy from their own perspective. Thank you, Gloria. Good morning, everyone. Dario, Marcelo, Miguel, Marvin here. And thank you very much for being here to accept the invitation to share our experience and the situation of distributed generation. I will speak in Portuñol. Who knows what's going to happen, but don't worry. So I would like to mention some of the aspects of distributed generation. Why is that considered an advantage to the energy sector? Something very important for the end user. And yesterday we were talking about democratizing access to energy and just transition. I think that distributed generation can really make a difference. So when we talk about energy, if I generate my own energy, of course that the energy bill will go down. In Brazil, for instance, monthly I paid 800 reales, something like $150, a little bit more of that. Today, my bill is 120. So that is a reduction. So generation close to the point of charge, that is also important. I have no losses of energy. Energy efficiency, that we have spent so much time talking about modernizing the energy mix of the countries. Reduction of investment, that is something else we talked about. And having new transmission networks. In that case, generated distribution can contribute with that. Also quantifying energy losses due to transportation, renewable sources, and job generation. In Brazil, there was a significant change since we started working on this. It generated 500,000 specialized jobs. That is something very positive. And talking about the reality in Brazil, we started with distributed generation as a concept. At first, it wasn't a law, it was a resolution by the regulatory body in Brazil. This started in 2012. The well-known 482 resolution that defined regulations for distributed generation and how it was going to work. So that would define the base, and we would have a net metering. My generation generated during the day, I could have a continuous change with a local distributor and compensating during the day, during the month, during the year. For instance, if we generated more in some months, you would generate a credit. If you generated less than that, you would compensate it. We started working like that. There were some other characteristics. I would have a period in which credits could be kept. I think that at the beginning it was 36 months, 3 years. If I have a credit of energy, I have up to 5 years to use it. I'm telling you all this because yesterday we talked about this, and in Chile it's a little bit different. For instance, in Brazil you cannot exchange that for money. It's always an energy credit. In my case, since my generation is more than what I use, today I have 3,000 kilowatts hour in my favor. I don't know what to do with this. I think I will just leave the light on for longer periods of time. Not very sustainable, by the way, but I cannot sell energy to my neighbors. You have to use it. What things could I do with that extra energy? If I had, because I don't have, but let's imagine if I had an office under my name as a legal person, yeah, in that case I could compensate and send that energy to my office. But it needs to be the same legal person. And it should be in the same energy distributor. It's not the same if you are in São Paulo, Campinas, and to compensate that in my parents' house, that is in Minas Gerais. I think that what's important is the bill. Sorry, the interpreter apologizes, but the speakers are not using the mic. So we made progress in that with 482. In 2015, there were some changes in the resolution. There were some proposals by the regulatory agency. There was the 687 regulation. And right there, we made significant improvement. Because we proposed 4 different business models. And the idea is to have the energy plus. Our initial proposal was to generate. I live in a group of flats, in a condo, and I have generation for the whole condo so that we can share. That was a good proposition. Then we have the idea or proposal of what I could do. For instance, the power in Brazil goes from, in the past was up to 5 megas, now is up to 3 in solar. But distributed generation is not only solar, we have biomass, biogas. So you can have distributed generation while working with renewable energies. In Brazil, for instance, you can use, even if you are far, far away from that point, you can create a plant that is far away from the point of use with the benefits of distributed generation. That can be all over the country. That was a very good proposal because investors that were interested found it very attractive. And that started in 2015 when they changed the resolution. And then the shared generation. That is a group of investors with the capital create a plant, for instance, of 3 megas, and they invite people that live, for instance, in buildings that have no capex for an installation, or maybe they are renting and they don't want to, whatever. They say, look, you can come with us, you can use our plant, and I will give you 10, 12, 15% discount in your bill. And you don't need to make an investment. You go to the website. We have like almost 20, 30 different companies doing this. We call it Energy Netflix. We are very creative, as you can see. Energy Uber. Basically, you go there, you enter your data, your personal data, you click, and after a couple of clicks, you accept, and the following month, you have a discount without any investment. That made everything grow in Brazil. So there was some possibility of change in Brazil, and that promoted distributed generation. We have a lot of people we have a lot of manufacturers, investors, structures. That is also positive because when you have competence within these actors, then the user have different options. And for you to have an idea, the growth recorded since 2017, in 2017, we have consumer units, users in Portuguese, In 2017, we had 40,300 plants of distributed generation. So in Brazil, you can have the plant and have that compensation. You can do it, remember, if you have the same legal person. We would have 4,328 in compensation. The current figures, for you to have an idea, we have 2,150,000 plants, energy plants, compensating in 3,150,000 consumer users. Some of them don't have a plant, but they are benefited because they can share this exceeding energy. For you to have an idea, in 2017, it's almost midway. It took us some time for all this to start working. We have 240 megas accumulated in distributed generation. From 2017 up to 2018, it was 80% growth. 2018, 2019, 270%. 2019, 2020, 82%. At the end of 2020, we had 5 giga, 160 power in distributed generation. At the end of 2022, we had 17 gigas of distributed generation, an average growth of 60%. Today, so far, is 24 gigas and 600 megas of distributed energy. By the end of the year, it's going to be 25 gigas of distributed. The power of solar is 35 gigas in Brazil, is of distributed generation. In centralized solar plants, we have 10 gigas. But the 25 gigas that we have of solar power in distributed generation, and I say almost because there are some other sources, we can say that there are 24 gigas of solar in distributed generation. So probably after 2020, when the pandemic started, at the beginning of 2020, we have 2 gigas for 25. Then we can discuss what happened, but I need to share my time here. I will give the floor to my friend Marvin here so that you can understand what is being said in the right Spanish, not in my Portuñol version. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. We would like to thank Oladia and Irina for being part of this panel of distributed generation that in some cases is not very well known, but in a way it's the largest contributor and the one that has the highest impact on the consumer, because it has a direct impact in the reduction of the bill, and it makes companies way more competitive. We represent the Association of Support to Renewable Energies. It was founded in 2012, and it promotes the use of renewable energy in Dominican Republic, both at large scale as in distributed generation. It's important to mention that we are an island that is not interconnected with any other country. Our neighbor is Haiti, and we have no way of interconnecting with them in a reliable, economic, feasible way. So we need to make use of those natural resources like sun, the wind, biomass, hydro, so that we can increase the use of renewable energies in Dominicana. We have some regulations. We have a law 125/01, and then we have law 5747, that is a promotion of renewable energies. Basically, is where we set the national goals to achieve 25% of generation should be as from renewable sources by 2025. That was included in that law, and we are on the right way to accomplish and fulfill our objectives. Also, since we don't have our own fuels in Dominican Republic, we depend a lot of these products. Close to 85% of generation in Dominican Republic comes from fossil fuels. Here we're talking about natural gas, mineral coal, fuel oil, number 6 and number 2, and the rest, 15%, is distributed between solar, wind, biomass, and hydroelectric. So we are committed to achieve decarbonization and to increase the quota of renewable energy by 2025. And by 2030 to reach 30% of decarbonization. We also have the distributed generation regulation. That law I told you about that was passed in 2012 defines the incentives for renewable energies in Dominican Republic. We believe that these should be kept so that we can achieve the objective set at national level. So in Dominican Republic, you have the possibility of, if you're a renewable energy project, you are exempted of taxes. Also, there's a fiscal incentive that started with a 75%, so you can discount that on the rent tax that was changed then, and it was lowered to 40%. But even with this 40%, projects are still very profitable and attractive for the investors. So that's why we have seen an increase in distributed generation in Dominican Republic and also at large scale. Currently, we have close to 372 megawatts that are installed in distributed generation. Together with the 1,109 of megawatts, we are reaching 1.5 giga of installed energy. It's important to mention that of those 372 megawatts, they represent close to 2% of the energy exchanged in the market by distributing companies. That is a significant value, and we believe that this may continue increasing depending on the penetration studies of PV in the distribution networks in Dominican Republic. We consider that possibility because the same regulatory framework proposes some restrictive topics regarding the capacity that can be added to a circuit without having to do any supplementary studies. We believe that those studies carried out through the German Alliance Cooperation, it mentions that the limit of 15% could be increased up to 25% in rural areas and 50% in urban projects, without having any kind of impact on service. So from the association, we are promoting that the regulatory body carries out those PV penetration studies in order to define those levels to which we may have access to. That is basically the big picture of Dominican Republic. We are going over and studying regulations. We believe that this should be strengthened and adapted to allow a better penetration of renewables. The growth curve is exponential, but still there are many challenges ahead on how to make processes simpler working on the interconnections to increase transparency of distributors, companies, penetration indexes, because it should be easier for users to have access to this kind of requests. We have organizations that are really in favor of this kind of generation. And as I told you initially, this started from the very beginning. It is important to align regulations with our commitments for the national development strategy, international commitments to achieve that decarbonization of the national economy. More than 60% of emissions are generated through the transportation system, and we need to adopt measures so that we can reduce emissions and have an impact on climate change, thus generating benefits not only to the environment but also to the economy, because a company that invests in renewables, it becomes more profitable. Why? Because the initial expenditure of paying a distributing company is now being saved. The state is also saving that money because they are not importing fuel, exporting dollars, and we know there's a high volatility of that variation of fuels due to the war in Ukraine. And remember that we are not producers. We have to buy fuels at the market price. So there are several benefits that we can get just because investing in renewable energy is improving quality of life, employment, competitivity. Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Miguel Hernandez, President of Solar Energy in Colombia. We would like to thank Oladia and Irina for inviting us and having us today to this panel. In Colombia, there's something very specific and that is different from the rest of Latin America, is that distributed generation in Colombia specifically applies to projects from 0 to 1 megawatts. The rest of the projects are called, according to regulations, is self-generation at small scale, and they go from 0 to 1 megawatt with credit recognition and other benefits, and also self-generation at large scale. Those are over 1 megawatt up to 5 megawatts to deliver energy without any credits, but the surplus is recognized. So when we get together and talk about distributed generation in Colombia, we think about those projects. And in the other countries it's different. Just distributed generation is the global topic. It includes everything. But in Colombia we have these three groups that are part of Regulation 174 that comes from 1715 law from 2014, that in a way started all these aspects of renewable energies. And then something else that is SE2023, that is utility scale, and in that case is over 1 megawatt. In ACOSOL, our work is focused on 174 generation at small scale, distributed generation, and self-generation in utility services. When we talked about self-generation at small scale, that is divided into two limits. Projects below or equal 100 kilowatts, or those projects over 1 kilowatt and over 1 megawatt. The main difference between these two powers is that projects below 100 kilowatts, energy credits are recognized and I can exchange those for consumption at night. And for that, you pay, let's call a toll that is 15% of the rate charged to the user. When it goes over 100 kilowatts, for instance, a project of 200 kilowatts, they don't pay that 15%, but they pay 65%. It's practically the whole fee minus generation. After netting that energy, there's still a surplus because credits, they have a limit and they cannot go over what is imported by the user. So if after that netting I have exceeding or surplus, that is at market level. So in our country, our hour, we have a price for that energy. And today, and due to El Niño or our self-generators, I have a company also, and they are having in positive balances. In Brazil, you cannot transform that energy into money. That's what you said. But we can in Colombia. In Colombia, according to the law, you can say keep that for 6 months, 1 year, and then in June, at the end of June, and December the 31st, you can authorize the grid operator so that on those days, if I have surplus, that can be sent to an account. And the account holder should be the owner. That is an advantage that we have, and we can transform that into money. That limit of 100 kilowatts that we will be talking about in the second topic, and it's based on the regulatory framework in Chile, US, Mexico. But those countries are in 300, 500, and distributed generation and is like 5-9 megawatts. For distributed generation, those projects only to sell energy, those are very interesting because these processes, in 6 months, that project can be ready and sending energy to the grid. And those projects can be connected to the local system, tension level 1 or 2 or 3. But there are some projects of 1 mega. There are in levels 2 and 3. They pay market value for the energy, and apart from that, you have a benefit that is 50% of technical losses in the connection point. The requirements for that, it's very clearly defined step by step in 174. And today, that is one of the most interesting points that we have that is very attractive for investment operations. When it comes to incentives in Colombia, I didn't know that in the Dominican Republic it was the same. On the one hand, the previous government, they exempted VAT and tariffs, and this made the whole process quicker, the whole exports process faster. And all those aspects that are cross-cutting to all the processes in customs and ports. Since they don't have VAT or tariffs, is way faster. And it reduced the cost of projects in our country. Also, 1715 law of 2014 left a regulation out that was updated by 2019 law, defined the tax benefits where I can reduce 50% of the VAT by my income declaration in a period of 1 or 15 years. That is an interesting challenge that we are facing. You can exempt VAT for some projects that have VAT, but even though they don't have it, there are control panels of investments that do have VAT, and all those other aspects are complementary to the project, including those projects before the regulatory agency, and those can be invoiced. And that allows, in a way, reducing up to 20% of the cost. And if I want to import that materials, in those cases they don't pay any tariffs. In some areas, there's a department that is called El Huila. We had a very interesting local benefits. All companies or natural processes that are implementing self-generation processes that represent 10% of saving, they get a 10% discount for 10 years. For companies So in Colombia, this topic is very attractive. We are making progress in the regulatory process. Brazil has set the example. In Colombia, we can share the surplus, but we don't have any shared generation. Thank you. Good morning, I'm Marcelo Mula. I represent the Uruguayan Association of Renewable Energies. Among other topics, we work with distributed generation. We have a special committee working on that. And I wanted to tell you the current situation in the country. As you know, in Uruguay, we have decarbonized the electric grid. 97% is renewable. Last year it was 90%. But that is not because of distributed generation, unfortunately. We've made great progress in macro parks, but distributed generation has not had such a big impact as in other Latin American countries. Distributed generation in Uruguay is what you mentioned. It's basically parts that are connected up to 150 kilowatts. It will include self-generation at industrial level, customers connected to mid-tension, 6, 15, 30 kilowatts, where up to this year there was a system that was only self-generation. With that definition and legislation by 2010, right now we have 35 megas installed of microgeneration and 15 mega of self. They add up 50 megas, and that represents 15% of the solar power in the country. When you mentioned that in Brazil it was over 60. So the energy policies in Uruguay promoted macro generation. But now we can say that we are not as well positioned as we are in other topics. Regarding power by number of clients, how much distributed generation we have, and depending on the number of clients in the country, Uruguay is about 35 watts, when Brazil is around 190 watts. Dominican Republic in 70 watts, and Colombia is a little below that. So when we talk about renewable energies, we are second after Denmark when it comes to penetration of generation sources of renewable, non-conventional. But in distributed generation, we see there's a good opportunity to make progress. And that is based on net metering of net balance of annual energy that equals 0. For instance, we cannot generate more than what we plan to use during the year. And the same with self-consumption. Now, if you have surplus, you can inject that into the grid. First, they ask you, how much do you think you're going to be using during the year? We allow you to generate a plant that can generate that amount of energy during the year. And then that exchange, we need to think how to transform that into money. So in Uruguay, if you have a surplus of energy, it is paid at the same price of the fee of the bill, let's say. Something else that is interesting, up to some years ago, there was a fiscal exemptions, always for companies, right? That was connected to the Investment Promotion Act. Today is restricted, it's up to 20% of the investment, and at the same time that investment should generate jobs in order to use PV. Because PV plants, one of the characteristics is that it doesn't need much maintenance. So that is something that we need to work on and to correct that. But the image that we have today, I mentioned PV because 98% of distributed generation in Uruguay is photovoltaic. We're in a situation in which we need to know what the neighbors are doing. We need to see where the world is going and adapt to that. The thing is that in Uruguay, the electricity bill, so if you think about what you pay for using the grid, that is part of the bill. That is something that we need to look at Brazil. I think that in Brazil they have 30% that was removed from the credit for using the grid to exchange energy. You also mentioned Dominican Republic with a different percentage. That may be one of the solutions. But the thing is that we are undergoing a situation in which we are analyzing possible changes for the future. The difference here that we have only one company, distributing company, that is the state, UTE. And since we are a state-owned company, in some cases we have a conflict between the promotion of the private sector to improve installations through benefits, and in some cases there's opposition to that because they see the private sector as a competitor. I know that because my company installs PV installations. So I think that the new business models for the distributors need to be rethought. Are they going to be thinking about selling energy or using the grid? I think that is an interesting topic to be discussed. And what to do when the electricity company is owned by the state. So it belongs to all of us. I think it's interesting to see the different approaches. Of course, there's room for improvement. I believe that what we need to do is to look at all the figures and decide how much energy should be charged and how much the client should pay for using the grid. And then again, all these, they need promotion. In Brazil, up to 70 kilowatts, you have no tolls for low tension. So maybe we need to escalate. And trying to help small-sized companies so that they can generate their own energy, and maybe they can save in energy on going to banks for green funding, there are a lot of opportunity for these kind of projects. So the first concept was to highlight those situations in Uruguay. Thank you, Gloria, and through Gloria, I would like to thank Olade for the possibility of being here today. I'm Darío Morales, Executive Director of ACESOL, and now forget about my Spanish, I'm going to be speaking my Chilean version. In Chile, we have different segments of what we call distributed generation. There's a first segment that is called net billing, that basically is destined to regulated clients that have no possibility of negotiating their energy consumption because they're small clients, they are regulated. They have the possibility of having access to net billing or self-consumption. And this defines that if you have a connected power of up to 300 kilowatts, they can use the benefits of net billing. For household consumption, that in general they have a consumption power of up to 10 kilowatts, they are allowed to have distributed generation and selling the surplus to the grid. And up to this segment, when that surplus is transformed in money for the client, that money can be received in cash. For larger installations that are not households, that are mid-size consumers, in that case it cannot be transformed in money, and it's transformed into a credit. This is a net billing scheme and not net metering. So the balance is at bill level, not an energy level. What does this mean? That when you count the injections into the grid, either to receive money or credits, these injections have a price. They are transformed into money, and then that money goes to my consumption. My consumption money, approximately 60% of that value, consumption value, corresponds to the buying of energy through the market, through private and public bidding processes. Then we add charge for transmission, that is 25%, and then we add another charge for distribution. So all of us who use energy in Chile, we pay for all those three things. When I inject my energy to the grid, it only uses, as a reference, the price of energy, 60% of what I pay for it. What's the aim of this? I try to have incentives so that installations inject as little as possible, because the energy that I save, that is 100% of that kilowatt or hour, but when I inject it, it's only 60%. Basically, the authority tries to control the injections to the grid. Then we have what we call self-consumption. Those are installations of any size. Some clients, the only restriction they have is that by definition they cannot send energy to the grid. They may have a plant on a parking side building, but the only condition is that they cannot send any electron to the grid. That's what we call the net billing scheme. We have another scheme that is PMGD, small medium of distributed generation, that is not associated to clients but associated to mid-size scale generation. This scheme appeared in 2005. As you probably know, Chile is a very long, thin country, 4,500 kilometers north-south and 200 kilometers east-west. In 2005, hydroelectric development was starting, and there were plants in the Andes mountain range, and they wanted to send that energy to the grid that was 100 kilometers away. Population density was not very high. However, there are small waterfalls that allowed to generate small mechanisms of 5 megawatts, 1 kilowatts. So the regulatory process allowed these people to install these generation plants. But since we don't have transmission networks or tensions of 66 kilowatts or 100 kilowatts, we will allow them to use the distribution grid for 13 or 23 kilowatts. However, these lines are very, very thin, and it was completely necessary to reinforce that distribution grid, to reinforce the conductor for those 100 kilometers. The distributing company, when they realized about that, they said this is not part of the distribution business, so what we ask the authority is that this generation medium to be connected should be neutral from the distribution business perspective. So they were allowed to pay all the reinforcements to be made along those lines. That allowed us to have this intermediate business. Another scheme was like this generation medium can sell its energy in the market where prices vary with the time of the day. However, getting funding for that within the finance project is very hard when the price changes in time. So the authority proposed a second scheme, that is the stabilized energy price scheme. It allowed them that apart from paying their own reinforcements of the grid, they were allowed to sell at a stabilized price in one node of the national electricity system. So the way they calculate this is that they consider a forecasted version in the long term, and they have an average, and that average is set for 6 months, and then you have a maximum band of variation. And since you have a clear methodology, and when you have bands, that allowed having long-term financing for these small and medium-sized generation companies. That was translated between 2005 and 2015 in a moderate advance and progress of generation and medium-sized scale. But as from 2015, when prices went down, especially in solar generation, this segment was solar generation was very competitive, and it grew a lot in this medium-sized generation sector. In fact, it grew so much that in 2020 the authority said, okay, this is growing too much, so we're going to be modifying the stabilized price system. Now it's not going to be fixed for 6 months, but we are going to be modulating one average day for each node in the country, and that average day will show different cost, hourly cost, and that hourly cost will be fixed for 6 months. Of course, that when you have a higher solar penetration, price is going to be lower, and prices at night were going to be higher. That had an impact on the development of solar mid-scale. The expectation of the authorities was to include storage mechanisms, but they still don't get the prices that can make that business model possible. And this stabilized price system has another component, that if I send my energy, for instance, to a node with a marginal cost of $50 and the stabilized cost is $60, that means that those $10, someone has to pay that to the distributed generation medium, and that is the large-scale distribution. The other way around, if the price of the node is $50 and the stabilized price is $40, those $10 are the generation mediums that have to pay the large scale. In Chile, we have several problems of congestion that are reducing marginal cost. So now the largest payment is on the large scale generation. Summing up, I believe that of those 33 gigawatts of installed power in Chile, there are 10 of solar. Of those 10, 3 corresponds to mid-scale generation, 7 to large-scale generation, but only 200 megawatts are generated by net billing. So I see success is moderated, but in net billing we are just not making, or we are not succeeding. And we need to think different ways on how to improve distributed generation in self-consumption and net billing. Basically because today in Chile we are discussing the bills to the end user that has been increasing lately for different reasons. And we are not paying attention how distributed generation, especially net billing, can make an important contribution to solving the problems with the increased bills. Thank you, Darío, and thanks everyone. I've seen how in this overview of the different contexts of the different countries, how they are making an effort regarding regulatory framework incentives. And how they try to make effort and to include distributed generation and self-consumption. But my question would be, which are the challenges that you see within this context? And I will ask you another opportunity, maybe 5 minutes for Q&A.
Escuchando chileno súper bien. Bien.
Muy bien, gracias. Bueno,
As Gloria mentioned, I'm going to be brief. I believe that we have some challenges at political, regulatory, and social levels. At social level, we have not been able so far of communicating in the right way the benefits of solar energy at small scale. And we then, as an association, we are facing the challenge of showing the population the benefits they can get from the bill perspective and how to face the reality imposed by climate change, that is basically energy poverty. It is more efficient that public funds provide support to this infrastructure instead of providing subsidies to the bill. From the regulatory perspective, in Chile, the electricity market has been changing significantly in the last years, except for the distribution segment. The distribution segment has not had any significant change in the last 40 years. We have made modifications to transmission, generation, but distribution is still with the same regulations of the last 40 years. And so, 40 years ago, we didn't have electromobility, distribution, shortage, net billing, net metering. And so, all the regulation of the distributing company and the whole regulatory scheme behind it prevent us from making the most of coordinated operations, micro networks. It prevents us from making the most of business models. We only have 2 of the 4 business models used in Brazil. It prevents us from making the most of opportunities. And on top of that, we have the difficulties set by distributing agencies because these new users are changing all the formats used in the last 40 years. And the third challenge is political. At least in Chile, we have always worked and differentiated the electricity market in 3 segments: generation, transmission, and distribution. And that is all right when the paradigm of giving energy to our populations was large-scale production, and then I needed to take that to all the households across the country. When demand, the only thing that they do is consuming, it works perfectly all right. But then when you have storage systems at large scale, when we have electric mobility, when we have distributed generation, when we have prosumers, then differentiated generation from transmission and distribution, those limits are not that clear now. Today in Chile we are talking about bills, we are talking about congestion in transmission lines, we are talking about organization of the markets, and in all those discussions that is only considered from large-scale generation, and they are ignoring the possibilities that are created by distributed generation. When distributed generation is just a small percentage of the market, nobody cares. And they say, okay, that's not a big problem. But if we fulfill the expectations, and this is an efficient tool against climate change, we need to reach an optimum level of distributed generation. And that specific optimum level will be important and significant and will interact with the large energy markets. If we don't take that into account, that interaction, we will not able to have an efficient and sustainable system as we all want. To be brief, what we need to take into account is this need of implementing distributed generation. They mentioned climate change, political decisions, national policies. So what we need to ask ourselves is, are our countries committed to climate change with the Paris agreements and the objectives? I think we all are. So when defining strategic policies, that is the government's responsibility. In the case of Uruguay, we signed in 2010 a long-term policy up to 2030 where it is mentioned that we need to fight climate change, and one of them is through renewable energies. In the case of my country, we were able to decarbonize the electricity grid, but we have an increase of demand, and we need to have continuous investment to provide services to that increase. And to know that we can do that in a decentralized way, I think it should be more important when considering national policies. Because then that is the umbrella that we can use when making decisions and implementing specific policies. In the case of Uruguay, we have regulations from 2010 that were minimally adapted in 2017. Sometimes it takes us too much time to make decisions, but I think that Brazil has very good examples of how distance generation, energy, communities, business models that can help. In Uruguay, we have less than 1,500 installations. Microgeneration and self-consumption, they are only 1,500. So we really need to improve those numbers. We need to make that compatible, in the case of Uruguay, with the national interests. So probably we also have to share the cost of using the grid, because one is connected to the other. If costs are transparent and you open business opportunities, it's a win-win situation. As we all say, this is here to stay, costs are going down. I think that the small companies are the ones that benefit the most. In Uruguay, a small company, they can pay $500 a month, and that is a very high cost. So today, and without using their own money, because you can use credit lines in Uruguay for the investment, so we have opportunities here. Let's see, how much is it going to be paid after contracts? I mean, contracts are up to 10 years, but technology lasts for 25 years. So we need to think what's going to happen after the 10th year. Maybe we can start implementing a credit model. When you have a company, you have your invoices with VAT, but if you have a physical person without any invoice, they transform that energy into money and it's discounted after VAT. We need to adapt that, we need to sit down, and I think these kind of exchanges are very useful, especially when they are so specific to distributed generation, because it allows us to really focus on this. So this is an interesting challenge that we can work on. The challenges that we are facing in Colombia, first is regulatory framework. We're working on the creation of a document to update regulations based on limits. In Colombia, at the end of 2022, and due to the information reported by almost the 85% of grid operators, in Colombia, for each department or states, we have one grid operator. So we have almost 32 grid operators. We have 32 departments, but apart from that, you may have people trading that energy. So in Colombia, we are working with us in those projects with more than 50 operators and traders of energy. And bills change or rates change in the different departments. For each user, we have 5 main types of users. Our country is one of the only countries where we have all these users stratified. We have Group 1, low resources. They have a bill that have a subsidy of 50% of the cost of energy. Then we have one of 40%, 30%. Tier 4, no subsidy. Tier 5, they pay 20% of contribution, 6, 20%, and so on and so forth. That is when it comes to regulated users. And all these users, they have a different rate in the different departments. So imagine how much work it takes. It was pretty complex how to dimension all this. So now we are working on a regulatory framework. In Colombia, in self-generation, we have almost 116 megawatts installed. When we analyzed this, we saw that 76% of this power are projects that are small or equal to 100 kilowatts. But then, these are projects that in fact are limited to 100 kilowatts. These limits, in a way, prevents self-generation from being implemented. Now, when they presented this study, and they passed that law, Chile had already migrated to 300 and Mexico to 500. And we stay there as from 2020 with those limits set. Remember that Chile is moving on to 500. That has been a limiting factor, and that is not the real power. We may have projects of 200 kilowatts DC. That is a point that is important. We have regulations that started in 2018, now we're in 2023. We have projected near to 300 megawatts installed between distributed generation and self-generation. And all this because of regulatory aspects. Since 2021, distributed generation moved from 100 kilowatts to 1 mega. It was a project that sells 100 kilowatts is not profitable. The first project of distributed generation in our country, that was in March this year, 1.33 megawatts. And all this because of regulation. And some other regulatory changes that we are having based on models in Chile and Brazil, Mexico, US, so that we can make the right progress in this area. Then we have tax issues. These benefits that we have are very interesting, but they are certainly focused on companies or natural persons with high income. So we need to find a mechanism that promotes or incentives to the users and start their own projects so that they can get some kind of benefits. We can look at the model in the US. The state provides a subsidy to part of the project value. Also, we're working in the social context, and that has to do with promotion. I think that November the 20th, we are going to have our first event in the Chocó. To show them what is self-generation. And something else we are working a lot is gender equity, and we have a gender committee so that our girls fall in love with engineering, with renewables. So these 4 points are very important for us. I think that we share many of these points. The Dominican Republic is the same, especially for regulation. I think that regulation is lagging behind because technology changes very, very quickly. Our regulation is of 2007, and our macro law comes from 2001. No, Eduardo is part of the Energy National Commission. The important thing here is that all the new aspects connected to regulation we have net metering, where you can exchange kilowatt hours at the same price, and at the end of the year you lose 25% of that energy and the remaining is paid. At the lowest price of residential price. That is important to mention. And not only about updating and strengthening regulations, but also complying with those regulations. We have current regulations that in some cases is not monitored or enforced. So updating is not enough if you don't enforce it. So complying with those regulations, that is very important. We also have an issue with distributing companies. In Dominican Republic, they have very high losses. And there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to management, transparency, bureaucracy, or trying to shorten periods. Because in some cases, in some cases, those processes can take too long. For instance, to change one of the metering systems, it can take very, very long time. And because of that, then projects may take a long time. Also, they need to pay for the regular bill, plus the financing in order to install the solar panels. So there's a lot of room for improvements. Also, automation of this process. At first, we had 2 or 3 clients with net metering, but now we have like 15,000 clients with net metering. So doing that manually in Excel, errors can be made. So the ideal thing would be to invest in some kind of software that automatically takes data and produces the invoice, because we need to reduce the number of human-made mistakes. And also credibility and claims by the users that say, now I got a higher bill, and maybe it was just a mistake, a human mistake. That is something that we want to work on. Financing is also that it's very relevant. How come it is easier to have a better rate for a vehicle than for a renewable system for a house or a business? Even though banks offer different products that is focused on renewable energy, it should be something more interesting with fewer restrictions, so that you can then carry out your project, and so that you're not that dependent on the grid. Something else that is crucial to us is to expand these limits that are not based in any technical regulation. Those should be expanded so that the same distribution company can then focus and include distribution and trading, so that they don't need to do supplementary studies for each client that goes beyond that limit. So we need to have those types of studies so that we can have everything defined. Isolated systems, also those that are part of the SENI system in the country, and to define the limits as from which they need to have supplementary studies. In our company, we're paying a lot of attention to regulations. We also have advisory services, and we're always paying attention to all the details that may take place in the changes of regulations. So I think that it's important to avoid surprises in this area of work.
Distribuida.
lo que hay es que aunar los esfuerzos entre todas las autoridades y tener como una visión general del país, de lo que se quiere lograr en temas de descarbonización, en temas de seguridad energética, resiliencia, fijar un balance que pueda ser bien para todos en temas de la misma empresa distribuidora y los clientes, y que no se vea esta visión que estaba diciendo desde Uruguay de que se vea a la generación distribuida como una competencia de las empresas de distribución. Al final es también un tema de doble vía, donde la misma empresa distribuidora asegura la compra a un precio, digamos que fijo, exento de todo este tipo de volatilidad, y mejora muchísimo lo que son los indicadores de calidad del servicio, de voltaje y de pérdidas en los circuitos de distribución. O sea que el apetito está. Los dominicanos queremos seguimos apostando a muchísimo más energía renovable, y la idea es de que todos caminemos en ese mismo sentido. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, agora hablar de los desafíos de Brasil, ¿no? Tenemos una hora, quizá. Seré puntual, pero una hora necesito, ¿no? Bueno, escuchando a todos, y hay similitudes, ¿no? Claro, un poco en cada uno, un poco más en uno, el otro. No se llega a 25 gigas de manera impune, ¿no? Hay que considerar eso. Me acuerdo cuando 2019, poco antes de la pandemia, como todavía no teníamos una ley nacional, estábamos bajo una resolución, y bajo una resolución, si se cambia los directivos de la agencia nacional, el viernes, el lunes, puede ser que pase que ellos no les guste mucho la generación distribuida, y le haga una firma y volvemos a la casa para pensar qué hacer. Entonces, y casi pasó eso en Brasil, cuando salieron con una idea muy buena de que, mira, esa tal generación distribuida está creciendo mucho mejor. Parar un poco con eso y vão sacar casi que el tema de la compensación se quedaría muy mal, los proyectos no iban a parar de pie. Entonces empezamos un debate nacional, pero ahí ya teníamos una masa de inversionistas, de pequeñas y medianas empresas. O sea, Brasil ya tenía ahí casi como en ese momento, 2019, unas 20.000 empresas que de alguna manera en todo Brasil trabajaban con eso. Hoy en Brasil vamos con los 5.560 municipios que tenemos en Brasil, todos tienen una usina de generación distribuida, que aunque sea una en Amazonia, por ejemplo, en un municipio pequeño ahí hay una, por lo menos. Entonces desde ahí empezamos el primer desafío, que fue tener una ley, porque una ley no se cambia tan fácil, hay que ir al Congreso, debatir, y aquí todos nosotros conocemos los temas políticos, es un camino duro. Entonces por ahí fuimos, y al final de agosto de 2021 a diciembre de 2021 también tuvimos en el Congreso. Inicio de 2022 el presidente pasó por el Senado, después el presidente firmó la ley que llamamos marco legal de la generación distribuida en Brasil, que es la ley 14.300. Bueno, y ahí los desafíos acabaron. Claro que no, los desafíos continúan. Tenemos desafíos ahorita técnicos, porque las distribuidoras que son aliadas en el tema, son aliadas. Algunos que quizá me escuchen van a decir, ese muchacho está loco, las distribuidoras no son aliadas, pero son, porque necesitamos de las distribuidoras para que se haga la cosa. Entonces tenemos que llegar a un punto de equilibrio en lo que estamos proponiendo, y me parece el mejor camino de verdad. Pero nem siempre la cosa sale bien. Los tiempos, de los permisos y de las miradas para las distribuidoras, de alguna manera hay un impacto, y hay un impacto en la generación distribuida. Entonces nos quedamos todavía en eso. Hay los temas técnicos que comenté. Ahora en Brasil empieza un problema de que en algunas áreas la cantidad de generación distribuida que tenemos es tan fuerte que es necesario que se hagan inversiones en la transmisión, en la red de la distribuidora, para que se pueda tener un número creciente ahí de usinas. Y es un debate que estamos. Algunos son reales, otros son propuestos como una excusa para que no se haga más proyectos ahí. Entonces hay que tener transparencia para saber cuáles son los reales, cuáles son los que no son tan reales. Tenemos una discusión también de interés político. ¿Qué pasa? Brasil es un continente. Ahí tenemos, por gracia, pero también por desgracia, todas las posibles fuentes energéticas. Entonces, además tenemos la eólica que va bien, pero ahora empezamos a hablar de la eólica offshore, tenemos la solar de usinas centralizadas, tenemos la hidro que de alguna manera está tocando la puerta diciendo, mira, necesito volver al escenario, y de hecho, en mi opinión, sí, las hidroeléctricas cumplen un papel fundamental. Las nucleares que también están en discusión, o sea, tenemos otras fuentes en Brasil. La BRD, que es la asociación que estoy, hace parte de un grupo que se llama FASE, que es el Fórum de las Asociaciones del Sector Eléctrico Brasileño. Hay 30 asociaciones del sector eléctrico brasileño en el FASE. Imagina una discusión en WhatsApp y en el FASE. No termina nunca. Nunca. É claro, todo mundo tem sua razão, não? Então, o único momento, por exemplo, que eu não tenho razão é quando me pongo a pelear com minha esposa. E aí a razão se vai. Pero em fase tenho razão. Digo, não, mira, a generação distribuída é boa por isso, por aquilo, por outro. Superamos o tema do desafio social. Ou seja, teníamos que explicar. Muitas vezes minha hija, quando sua amiguita perguntava, tu papá trabalha em quê? E ela me mirava, trabalha em quê? E eu falava em generação distribuída. E ela falava, em quê? E aí, pero isso já está superado, porque já há um entendimento de lo que é a generação distribuída, pero foi um desafio para que pudiéramos crescer. Bueno, então, como comentei, vamos alcançar quizá uns 7, 8 gigas esse ano. Vamos começar a fletar a curva, ou seja, não é possível crescer a esta velocidade todos os anos, quizá, em minha percepção, vamos por uns 5 gigas, 6 gigas anuais. Há outras modalidades, em princípio, ahorita de enero de 2024, ou seja, 45 dias mais, vai haver um cambio na legislação do Brasil, com uma possibilidade aún mais para o mercado livre em Brasil. Todas as empresas que estão em la alta tensão vão poder acessar o mercado livre de Brasil. Para 2026, todos os grupos B barra tensão, com exceção de los residenciales e rural, também vão poder ir para o mercado livre de Brasil. E 2028, todos os usuários, clientes de Brasil, seja o que seja, vão poder acessar. Isso é um cambio. Además, cerrando aqui minha participação, estamos propondo em esse grupo aqui, falando de desafios, que aqui quizá está nasce aqui um nascimento de uma proposta de uma associação latino-americana que vai conversar, mirar estes desafios e os êxitos de cada de nós para uma associação latino-americana de recursos energéticos distribuídos, porque a tecnologia sempre vai chegar antes do jurídico, de lo que seja, ou seja, isso vai ser. Então, o tema de las baterias, do armazenamento, da mobilidade elétrica, da generação própria, isso vai sobrepassar o que hasta hoje estamos mirando, não? Essa discussão incluso é nova. Quizá não estaríamos aqui 10 anos atrás porque era outra realidade. Então, o que estamos pensando é por onde podemos ir e que há de novo com o tema de la energia renovável em Latinoamérica. E temos, de hecho, muitíssimas possibilidades. É isso? Glória, contigo.
Mil gracias. Quiero como comentar que este tipo de espacios, esto es lo que genera, ¿no? También estas ideas, esta posible asociación que de hecho es importante, que Latinoamérica la necesita y que al final es para eso que se hace tanto esfuerzo para esto en estos espacios, ¿no? Para que se puedan hacer estas interconexiones, este networking, este intercambio de experiencias que creo que todos necesitamos y bueno, en pro de lo que OLADE está trabajando en este momento, ¿no?
Y seguro ya tenemos el apoyo de OLADE, quería
Correcto.
agradecer a Gloria.
De acuerdo.
Todavía no había hablado, pero como está filmado.
Ya lo tenía anotado como para decirte al rato cuando hacemos la reunión, pero obviamente sí, ese es el espíritu que tiene la Organización Latinoamericana de Energía y es eso, ¿no? Hacer la integración en todos los sentidos, ¿no? Y obviamente el tema de cooperación que viene a hacer esto, ¿no? Estos intercambios y demás. Yo sé que ya estamos tarde, pero sí me gustaría tal vez algunas preguntitas del público. Si tienen, pidiendo también brevedad para poder pues atender otros eventos y la clausura de la Semana de la Energía que es a las 12 del mediodía. Entonces no sé si alguien tiene alguna consultita y si no, pues entonces, aquí hay una.
Una pregunta rápida. ¿Cuál sería de
Which do you think should be the limits when carrying out this connectivity with the distribution grids? I imagine that depends on the reality of each country. In the Amazon, we have a group of isolated communities, and they have energy 4 hours a day on using diesel generators. So there's clearly an opportunity for batteries, smart grids, microgrids, and generate energy through distributed generation because the impact is way lower. Imagine just cutting down trees for panels. That's not sustainable. First, as everything in life, we grow and then we reach a point in which that's not feasible anymore and we have to find some solutions. That is a natural part of the process. To see where we can decentralize energy use. We need to regulate and we need to talk with all the other actors, and that is positive. And also to take into account that the market is constantly changing. Demand increases, at least in Dominican Republic, it's growing over 6% annually. So you have to consider both aspects, generation and demand. And when is it that you are sending energy to the grid? If it is midday, what happens at midday? Whether you have a peak of demand, and then you have to see whether it matches solar or something else, and how can that affect the level of the quality of the service. You need to have affordable prices. But it is clear that having distributed resources, for instance, to make sure that if you have a cloud passing over, that won't affect generation. In Dominican Republic, we are thinking about including batteries to those projects over 50 megawatts. We need to avoid that capacity goes down. it's important to have penetration studies because each circuit is different. Let me complement that. Maybe the question is, why is it that we have those limits? When in 2008, 2010, we started going through these issues, we defined limits so that we could have a coverage enough so we cannot have any problems with I think those regulations are more than 10 years old. So what we need to do is to revise those to see the reality of each country. In Uruguay, we study all projects case by case. But there's a limit. If they tell you you cannot install more than 150 kilowatts for microgeneration, in some cases, those limits are linked to the reality 15 years ago. But the grid, of course, grew in that period. And now we know much more about what's distributed generation today. I think that the answer to that is we have a learning process and we need to check that. There are a lot of restrictions if the limit is 150 kilowatts. Just one small detail. Today, based on what Marcelo mentioned, Chile, the limit of 300 kilowatts. Congress is working to increase that up to 500. What we said and suggested is that that should be power that is higher than the one in the grid. In Colombia, one of the aspects was to calculate the average of all transformers connected in low tension. At the moment, there were no studies about that. But now we're having more and more transformers included. We are talking about 2018, 2023. The best thing that we can do and what we are doing in Ecosol is to check progress made in Brazil that have already gone through this so that we don't follow the same path. If this has already been implemented in some countries and has been successful, then we can follow that path. I would like to thank our speakers.
Lamentablemente tenemos que terminar hoy esta conversación.
Unfortunately, we have to finish this conversation. So I invite you to join OLADE's social networks on all the training system that we have there. That should allow us to do all this. So now let's share a coffee break, and then in this same room we'll continue with electromobility. So thank you.